Hello, I'm Andy Ridenour, and welcome to an evening with Joe Dobbs, a person most of you may know in one capacity or another. He is a musicologist, a musician, entrepreneur, vintage instrument dealer, and a radio program host. And Joe, good evening.
Well, after an introduction like that, I really don't know what to say.
Well, I'm going to give you some good questions to respond to here and give you something to respond to. First off, let's go back to what brought you to West Virginia and where you started out from.
Well, I grew up in Louisiana, and as a kid, I never liked where I lived. I never liked the swamps. And I remember I used to look at pictures on a calendar when I was a kid that had these mountains on it. I didn't like the heat, the bugs, or anything about the swamps. So when I was never attached to my home. I really never felt like I had a home. I only went back there if someone in the family was sick or something, or just to visit. And I lived in the Southwest for a while. I lived in Houston. I lived in New Mexico. And then I moved to Nashville, not with the music business, and I went to work for a record company in Nashville, and this was in 1967. And they gave me West Virginia as one of my territories to come here for a record dealer and sell records, and I loved it. I loved the people and also the terrain, the climate. And so that's how we decided to move here, and I've always felt like West Virginia's home. Well, 67, that's a lot of years I've been here. And it's the only place I've ever lived where I thought I was home.
You, as a musician, was there anything that interested you in West Virginia from a musical standpoint?
No, the music kind of happened. Mm-hmm. My ancestors were Scotch-Irish, but they came through the Carolinas and through Alabama and Mississippi. Both my parents were from Mississippi. And there were traditional musicians in my family. So when I got up to West Virginia and started going to some festivals, they played the same tunes that I'd learned to play that my grandfather played. Of course, the music was brought to the country, by the immigration from Scotland, Ireland, and England. But that just kind of happened. I really didn't move to West Virginia for the music.
What kind of instruments do you play? I mean, how many different kinds?
Well, I think of myself as a fiddle player, and I'm just a fretted instrument player, or fiddle. I play a little mandolin, and I can strum a few chords on the guitar, but I don't really count that. I'm really basically a fiddle player.
What is I would put you in a category of Appalachian musicologist. Being a player, what gave you that interest in Appalachian music, going much deeper than just coming out of your family roots? What gave you that interest?
Well, I think as folk musicians, we're kind of victims of stereotyping. Let me expound on that a little bit. When I started out playing, I finished high school in '52, so I started playing in actually junior high school and started playing fiddle tunes like Arkansas Traveler, Soldier's Joy, and I was considered a fiddler, which really wasn't thought too well of by the family. And then after I got out of high school, I moved to Texas, and I kept playing music and played in the club scene. I played Soldier's Joy and Arkansas Traveler, and then I was a Texas swing fiddle player. Mm-hmm. So then when I moved to West Virginia, I went to festivals and I played Soldier's Joy and Arkansas Traveler, those same tunes, but we've been elevated somewhat. Now we're folk artists or folk musicians. So I think the point I'm trying to make is it's a classification that people put on the music, and a lot of it had to do with the revival of folklorists and musicologists during the 60s. But we're all still playing the same tunes.
Who were your influences musically?
Well, I would have to say a lot of my influences were what I heard on the Grand Ole Opry in the 40s. But there was an old fiddler at home who taught me a lot of tunes.
Mm-hmm. You have participated in the Augusta Heritage Festival, not only as a performer, but as a teacher. Mm-hmm. When you're in that capacity as a teacher, what kind of things do you try to get across to your students who are there for the Appalachian fiddle?
Well, I think what you try to instill in the students is how old this music is. In 1979, I had the good fortune of going to Scotland and Ireland. And I was at a festival in Inverness, Scotland. And after the show, we're sitting in the hotel there playing fiddle tunes. Several fiddlers. So I sat down there, and they're all playing tunes. And I knew one out of every 3 tunes they played. I would say, what do you call that tune? And they'd tell me, and I'd say, well, we call that tune so-and-so. So finally, one of the guys turned around and says, by Jove, give the laddie a fiddle. He knows the tunes. But then I realized, you see, a lot of the tunes, when I learned to play them, I thought they were just tunes that my grandfather played in Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And until the people came along in the 60s, and there's all this delving into where the music comes from. I had no idea the music was that old. I really didn't realize it till I went to Scotland. For instance, they played a tune that we've always called Too Young to Marry in the South. Here, Clark Kessinger played it, and he called it Sweet 16. And in Scotland, they still play the tune, and it's called My Love Is But a Lassie Yet. But what is really intriguing, if you're a musician, you realize that this has been handed down a couple of 100 years orally, and there's still enough, or more than enough, of the melody survived, all that exchange orally, that you still recognize the tune.
As this music migrated, as you indicated with your forefathers that migrated west, and you ended up in Texas yourself doing some of the Texas swing music, mm-hmm. Was there any crossover there in terms of these tunes being evolving into something different?
Yeah, sure. Well, in this country, Bill Monroe, in the mountains, eastern mountains, Bill Monroe took a lot of the old folk songs and the old fiddle tunes, and he kept a straight chord. We'll get a little technical here. He just kept a straight chord rhythm with the guitars and formed it and added different instruments and called it bluegrass. Well, out west, Bob Wills took the same tunes. His dad was a great old-time fiddler. So was he a good old-time fiddler. But they took it and they used a little different theory. They put a lot of chords behind the music and kept the melodies simple, and they called it Western swing. But Bob Wills did Stay All Night, Stay a Little Longer, da-da-da-da-da-da. It's really old Dan Tucker, a fiddle tune. And so out of that Appalachian folk music, and of course we won't get into the ballads and the influence on country western music, but you had 2 distinct styles of music evolved with a little different use of musical theory of western swing and bluegrass.
Let's take it in a little different direction now. You, because of your music talents, were able to travel overseas. And how was the music received on some of your tours that you did when you were in Northern Africa?
Tell us
a little bit about those experiences.
Well, that was a great experience for me, probably one of the great experiences of this lifetime for me. Well, first of all, I went over with Mary Faith Rhodes, who's a hammer dulcimer player, and she played mountain dulcimer, sang a lot of mountain ballads, and then I was playing fiddle and mandolin. And so we played nothing but Appalachian music, and we went over for the United States Information Agency, and we toured the poor countries of North Africa. So we went to Washington, D.C. to get our visas, and while we were there, well, I just go in and talk to the head of the U.S. Information Agency, and I said, of all these people and all these artists, all these entertainers that you could get to go to Africa, why did you choose Mary and I? We're just folk musicians. Nobody knows us. So he told me, he said, well, you're going to countries where there are, the people are very poor, so-called third world countries. And he said, those people think of us as a technology of airplanes, computers, and all this. But he said, when you go over there and you play folk music is about the people. It's about the human passions and problems in a human society. Then they began to realize that we're human too. And it was a wonderful experience because everywhere we went, we played a lot of college campuses and played a lot of schoolrooms, just like we do here in West Virginia. But it was so heartwarming for me because I never expected to be accepted that well. Because we go in with just a fiddle and a guitar and a hammered dulcimer. You know, we don't have a sound stage with strobe lights and dancing girls and fog machines. It's just plain old folk music. And And they loved it. At the end of the concerts, invariably, they performed for us too. They said, you know, man, we'd like to play you some of our music. So it's a pride that is beginning to come back in this country. That your folk music is very important. So all these tunes that I thought my grandfather and his brothers made up, I realize is really a part of our culture. And to take you even further, people who made cartoons in this country, Disney people, they realize the value of these folk tunes. Like Popeye is a fiddle tune that's always been square danced to in the Appalachian region, right here in West Virginia. It's called the Sailor's Hornpipe or the College Hornpipe. And there are many of those tunes. But then what I did, after coming back from Africa, where we were so warmly received, when I go into a classroom, you know, I try to talk to the kids. And they listen. I say, I have played this music in foreign countries. And I might mention that we played in France and places where they knew more about Carter family than I did. And in England and Scotland, they knew more about my folk music than I did. I mean, what happened in this country. So I always tell the kids out there, you know, if you got a grandfather or aunt or someone in your family who plays those melodies and plays folk music, even though they may not sound as good as maybe the people you see on TV or MTV or whatnot, but what they're doing, they're carrying on a very important part of our culture.
Do you find that young people are still or either regaining or just as interested in what you're doing
just
musically?
As interested. They really are. They may not have the desire to play. Some are playing. We're a little concerned about that now. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there were a lot more young people playing music. Now they're in their 20s and 30s. We're a little concerned about that, that not as many people are playing folk music, young people, but they are interested. I go in a classroom. We do a lot of stuff in the classroom with West Virginia Studies, which I think is the 9th grade, and I may have this confused. There's a 4th grade class. And we go in and we talk about, demonstrate playing a lot of different instruments and talk about the music and how important it is and where it came from. The kids are really interested.
How important is it, Joe?
That's a good question. I really don't know. I can just explain it this way. Once when I lived in Huntington, Dave Payton and I performed for a group of Japanese businessmen. They came and asked us to play, the people who were entertaining Japanese businessmen at the local country club. And they said, one of the nicest things that'll happen to you if you go to Japan, and the thing that's very important with them, is if they play their folk music for you. So we want you to come and play your folk music for them. I really don't know how important it is. It's some kind of binding thing that holds us together. And probably between American folk music and the blues brought to this country by the slaves, the Afro-Americans, the amount of music that's grown out of this in our popular music today is beyond our imagination.
Well, you brought up you used the word businessman, so let's use that as a segue to shift gears here.
Okay.
And because you have what I think is one of the most fascinating jobs that I know of, and that you have a music store in St. Albans, West Virginia, the Fret and Fiddle Music Shop, which, aside from being a music store, you also deal in vintage instruments. And tell us first, starting off generally, how did you get involved in the music store business? What got you involved in that?
Well, the music store business, I decided I wanted to make some violins. Being a player, and when I was going to college in the early 50s, every time I would write a thesis or anything, if I had a choice, I'd write on violin makers. So I always had the idea, one of these days I'm going to sit down and make some violins. So I decided to do some repair work and buy the necessary tools. There are a lot of special hand tools you have to buy if you're an instrument maker. And so I started a little repair business, and I passed around the word where I worked. I said, well, I do repair. And I had done some repair with a couple of violin makers. So it grew out of my basement. My brother came to visit me, and he said, you need a store. I said, I don't want a store. I'd have to get up at 9 o'clock in the morning to open the door. I said, I'm playing at folk festivals. He said, well, how about us going in business, and I'll run the store, and you go to the folk festival. So that's how I got started. It was a basement hobby that wound up in a business.
And that expanded into a full-fledged store now that you have in the main downtown shopping area of St. Albans, and how did you get into the vintage?
In 1979 or 80, there was a decline in instrument sales in the United States, not just in West Virginia, it was all across the country. All at once, they were concerned because enough kids wasn't signing up for band instruments, and a lot of kids were not taking interest in the string programs across the country. So our business went down like a lot of people's. So quite frankly, in 1981, our business was to the point that I didn't tell my customers, but I realized I was going to have to move to a big city or get into something else. I could take my specialized business of repair and just stringed instruments to Pittsburgh or some city of this size. So I really did not want to leave West Virginia because it's the only place I ever lived that I felt at home. And so I accidentally, by chasing down some instruments for some friends of mine, I'd always sold what few vintage instruments I got to other dealers. It just kind of evolved by people asking me to get instruments, and then my business picked back up. And so we decided to stay in West Virginia because we liked it. We settled for less money, but for the joy of living in the state.
You getting involved in this vintage business has given you an international scope now that we were talking about earlier before we got on camera. Explain to us how that's all come to be. You're now dealing with Japanese, British. What's going on? What kind of, you're watching the business news now to keep track of the dollar.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the vintage business, first of all, if you find an instrument like one of these sitting around me here that's a vintage instrument, but you have to find a buyer. You have to find somebody that's going to buy it, and especially if you're a struggling businessman, you don't get a payday till you sell it. So you have to turn your money. So I just copied some of the things that the other dealers were doing. I picked up trade magazines and I saw their ads in there. So we advertised in trade magazines that sell internationally. Guitar Player, Guitar World, and Bluegrass Unlimited. We always have an ad in there in the classified. But what a lot of people don't realize about instruments, musical instruments, is first of all that Americans in this country, we make the best stringed instruments anywhere, with the exception of old Italian violins, and sometimes I have my doubts about that. But all over the world, and I realized this when I went to Europe too, because nobody was playing Martin and Gibson American-made guitars. The best guitar I saw to speak of in England, Germany, and Scotland was a Yamaha, which over here was considered a student guitar at the time. Not that it didn't make better, but if you lived here, you wanted a Martin or a Gibson or a Gilder, American-made. So to go back to why the market is such it is, we're really, on this planet, we're a community. And one of these days, we're going to all have to realize that we're not so different from our neighbors across the way. Maybe we talk different, we have different customs, but our music is growing to be the same. Let's take a pop artist like Guns N' Roses. They're real big right now. So if you live in Beijing...
They're a rock and roll band.
Yeah, Guns N' Roses, rock and roll band, pop music. So if you live in Thailand, you live in Moscow, you live in Yugoslavia, or Berlin, or Paris, or Beckley, West Virginia, or Los Angeles, California, and you're a player, you would like to have an instrument like they have. So they play Gibson guitars, which are American-made. So that makes that guitar sell. And I could go on and on. If you're a bluegrass musician, you like Bill Monroe, he plays an instrument that looks like this mandolin here. That's what you want. And bluegrass is popular in a lot of the European countries, Australia and everywhere. So these people get these trade magazines. If you're a guitar player and you're a striving musician, you want the magazine. And what we don't realize is a lot of times outside the country, these people do speak English, or they can read and understand English. But an interesting aspect that affects all of us in the business is the fax machine. I could not do my business without the fax machine, because I have customers who read and write English, and they send me a fax, and we communicate by the fax machine. And even after they buy the instrument, they even write you back how well they liked it or whatever.
Well, this international business certainly has put you in a position to come across some fascinating vintage instruments. Can you tell us about a couple of them, or what some of your favorites that you have?
Well, we brought some here today. It changes all the time. I'll just pick up this violin. I think this is a very interesting instrument. This is made by a very famous French violin maker in 1855. You notice it has a carved head on it. It's called a head violin. His name was Darazé. And during his time, he worked in Paris, and a lot of his violins sell for a lot of money today. He made a whole set of violins with all the disciples' pictures on the headstock. On the peg head. Mm-hmm. If you'll notice closely, it has flowers in the corner here. And I'm going to turn it over, and I hope we can get a close-up shot. This is wood marquetry. It's not painted on. It's inlaid wood, and it was very popular in Europe in the 1850s.
You might want to straighten that up a little bit.
Okay. And the classical musician never liked the gaudy fiddle. So classical musicians didn't play them. And actually, if this violin was a real Darazé and it didn't have all the ornate, it would be worth about twice as much. But I think this is an interesting instrument. Now they're somewhat in demand. Vassar Clements, who's been on Mountain Stage, plays a fiddle with a head on it with all kind of ornamentation. I don't know if it's Darazé or not. He's one of the few professionals that I know play them. But now, in Nashville, they're very popular. John Hartford plays one. Danny Kelly, who plays with Roy Acuff, who's from southern Pennsylvania, played one. Mark O'Connor is playing one now. But I think it's a very interesting piece. It's
Maybe we'll have you play a tune on that in just a moment. There's a couple other things we want to touch on here, Joe, as our time's running out. First off, this is an interesting looking, unique to me instrument. Can you briefly tell us about that? And
I think these instruments this is a Gibson guitar harp. They carried them in their catalog till 1934. Around the turn of the century, there were a lot of German-made guitar harps. The only person I know of playing one today professionally is Michael Hedges, and he's written a lot of special music for the guitar harp. In Charleston, Chuck Beal, who's a teacher at West Virginia State, bought a Dyer Brothers guitar harp off me that looks a lot like this, but it's basically the same instrument, just a different maker. And he uses different tunings on these strings here and writes music for it.
Okay. Well, let's help you put this back over here. Let's touch on one other facet of your life, and that's you're the host of a West Virginia Public Radio program called Music from the Mountains. It's on Saturday nights at 8 o'clock. Tell us briefly a little bit about the show and what you're trying to do with that and what you do with it.
Music from the Mountains, I inherited a show from Paul Epstein. And the reason I took the show is when we talked about when I got in the music store business, I had all these people come in that you don't know about. They're what I call closet musicians. Some of them are professional people. Some just may be a tobacco farmer. And one may be a judge or an attorney. And they play incredibly well. And you never are aware of this unless you get in the music store business. So I thought it'd be nice if we could show the folks out there that there are neighbors who play incredibly well, just have no professional ambitions. And also the preservation of Appalachian folk music. After my trip to Africa, I really realized for some reason it's very important that those tunes are kept alive. And there are a lot of musicologists, like Franklin George and these people and the late Dr. Pat Gaynor who worked on this in West Virginia. And they just did a great thing. And I would like to be a part of that. I enjoy the show. I enjoy the people that come on the show. Being in business, quite frankly, I really don't have the time for it. I enjoy it so much, and I enjoy the people coming in. And I believe in what public radio is doing and public television. So we do continue. And I'd like to say that I really appreciate all those people who come and give their time to play and perform for us on the radio.
Well, Joe, I've certainly enjoyed our evening together here, and I'm sure our viewers have also. I want to ask you, the last thing that we really haven't talked about is your actual musicianship. If you'd play us a tune or two on that fiddle.
Sure.
And let me wish you a good evening and much success in your future endeavors, and good luck with the radio show. And
well, thank you, Andy. And I admire what you're doing with Mountain State, so good luck to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to play a little fiddle tune. Is that
what are you going to entertain us with here?
Well, I hope it's entertaining. You know, normally fiddle players have a guitar with them. We're going to play a tune that I learned when I was very young. It's called Arkansas Traveler.